Hi there! If anyone stuck around for the past year and a bit, hello! It is so good to talk to you again, and I hope you're all staying safe and healthy and sane during these times. 2019 was a bit of a roller coaster, but I'm glad to say that I've mostly landed on my feet, and I'm really looking forward to pouring myself back into reading and some of my creative hobbies. And what better hobby is there for someone who can't get enough of her own face? Anyway, I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about all the books that I've read so far this year. So without any further ado, let's get to it. So the first book I read in 2020 was Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe, and this is hands down one of the most important books I've ever read. Every person living in so-called Australia has to read this book. In this book, Bruce Pascoe systematically deconstructs the myth that Aboriginal people living on the Australian continent were these primitive hunter-gatherers. He takes you through swathes of primary sources, mostly travel logs and journal entries of early explorers and settlers. All of them basically document how Indigenous people actually had these complex and sophisticated systems of agriculture, aquaculture, housing, and social policy. But most importantly, these systems were rooted in a profound spiritual connection to the land and were bound by sacred rituals that cemented a deep love and respect for nature. Until reading it, I never truly realized the extent of the deception and miseducation in what I was taught growing up. Sure, I was taught in a vague, nebulous sense about the negative effects of colonization, but this book was just so concrete and solid in a way that my school curriculum never was, and it just made me realize how much of the picture I was missing. I know now that these critical pieces of evidence were purposefully obscured to delegitimize any claim Aboriginal people had over their land. And of course, this was to justify dispossession and genocide because, hey, they were just these hunter-gatherers. They were barely surviving before white people came along with their agriculture and industrialization. There are so many examples in this book that completely transformed my view of Indigenous culture and history. For example, agriculture. There are accounts of generations of women harvesting and cultivating yams, songlines and mythology about sowing seeds and harvesting wheat and grain, passed on through centuries of oral traditions. But no, all we learn about at school are witchetty grubs. Pascoe also tells us about this absolutely remarkable whaling ritual where the UN people would actually work together with pods of killer whales who would actually help the human hunters hunt smaller species of whales by rounding them up and pushing them closer to the shore where they'd be easier targets. And then the hunters would thank the killer whales by offering them a piece of their most recent game's tongue. So really it was this equitable partnership between human beings and killer whales. What? I could go on and on about this book, and it's really only just scratching the surface. I mean, I have so much more to learn about Indigenous culture and history. And it really just goes to show that First Nations people are the real experts when it comes to land management and ecological sustainability. I mean, they have literally been doing it for millennia. Anyway, Dark Emu was absolutely remarkable. I implore you all to read it. The next book I read was The Burning Bridge by John Flanagan. Now, this is the second book in the Ranger's Apprentice series. The Ranger's Apprentice series is about a boy named Will who lives in this fictional quasi-England kingdom of Araluen, where he is a ward of the state because he's an orphan. Now, when wards of the state come of age, they have to apply to be accepted into a trade, and much to Will's surprise, he is accepted to train under the court's Ranger Holt. And the series follows his adventures learning how to become a ranger, who are basically like spies and informants, arbiters of the law and strategists to the king of Araluen. Now, in the second book of the series, the plot thickens with a mystery involving a deserted neighboring kingdom and a dark force sweeping across the land. These books are actually a reread for me. I read them for the first time when I was in year 5 with my friends at the time, and I just remember absolutely falling in love with this new fantasy world. I actually listened to this book on audio, and the narrator, Jonathan Zappa, he does an absolutely remarkable job. His voices and his performance in general is just so theatrical and so immersive. It was brilliant. So yes, I did really enjoy this book. However, I think I should note that the author does tend to over-narrate some scenes and some interactions between characters at times. Like, so-and-so character had such and such expression on their face because they were thinking of such and such, and they used this tone because they wanted to convey this and not that. So sometimes that could get a little bit grating. But on the plus side, the point of view in this book isn't limited. So in any particular scene, you get a little bit of an insight as to what's going on inside each of the heads of all the characters involved, which is quite nice. So on the whole, I still really do care a lot for these characters, and I am still very much invested in this story. There's also a really big cliffhanger at the end of book 2, and I am anxiously waiting for the next audiobook to become available on my library's app. The third book I read this year was Felicity by Mary Oliver. Now, this is actually the first ever poetry collection that I've picked up for fun of my own volition. This poetry collection deals with lots of really pleasant themes like hope and love and peace, and it has lots of natural imagery, a lot of tree related imagery, which, to be fair, I concur, trees are amazing and vital. Oliver's tone had a real sense of levity and playfulness throughout this collection. I particularly enjoyed the poem I Am Pleased to Tell You, which is basically the persona addressing death in this really cheeky and playful way. While I did enjoy several of the poems in this collection, I just think on the whole, it lacked weight and impact. For me, I think a good collection needs to have some contrast and some movement, light and shade, and for me that wasn't really there with this collection. But I am open to picking up more of Mary Oliver's poetry. I found it really accessible and easy to read, and I'm really looking forward to sinking my teeth into more poetry in general. Okay, sorry if the angle and lighting changed really quickly. I had to take a brief intermission to recharge the camera. Cool, let's get back to it. The next book I read this year was How to Do Everything and Be Happy by Peter Jones. I picked this book up because the answer to the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, for me changes on an hourly basis because I'm just interested in so many things. It's also part of the reason I have indefinitely suspended my undergrad. So I thought this book could provide some useful insights on how to do everything and be happy. There was a lot to like here. I thought the writing style was really simple and conversational without any of the mystique and pomp that you might find in books that cover similar topics. This book is basically a guide to live a happier, more meaningful life. It had lots of common sense advice like get a diary or a calendar to manage your time, take time for yourself, set goals. It also had some really thoughtful insights. For example, he talks about how happiness isn't just the absence of problems, how positive experiences have their own inherent value and don't just exist to negate life's struggles or difficulties. Little things like that I actually found really, really helpful and, quite uplifting. It did finally prompt me to create my own bucket list, which I update too frequently. Ultimately though, this book did not help me figure out what to do with my life, but it was enjoyable and interesting enough and gave a few useful tips on living more intentionally in general. I actually have a physical copy of this next book. I'm just gonna go grab it. I'm back! Ugh. And the next book I read was Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. This book has been so popular on BookTube and it was even longlisted for the Women's Prize, so I was really, really hyped up to read this book. But it was so disappointing. For anyone who doesn't know, Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine is about a woman named Eleanor who is completely alone. She has no friends, she's completely isolated. She doesn't really talk to anyone except for the bus driver and her local convenience store cashier. And she thinks this is normal. She's perfectly happy. She doesn't think there's anything wrong with her life. Then one day, her and a colleague see an old man collapse on the street and they help him. That small event gradually leads to her life opening up to all these new experiences. So don't get me wrong, when I say I was disappointed, it was still fun and readable and it was interesting enough to keep me going until the very end, but it was nothing special. Honestly, it was very overwritten. I found the characterization in general very clunky and heavy-handed. Especially Eleanor, she had no depth to her character. Her narration was almost cartoonish. She did not sound like a real person, and that made the whole experience just constantly really, really jarring, and it just reminded you that you were reading a novel and it just wouldn't allow you to fully suspend your disbelief. So safe to say this book did not impress me, which is quite a shame. But it might do the trick for you if you're looking for a light and easy read and just find the premise interesting. Then I read The Bullet Journal Method by writer Carol. I stumbled onto this book because I'd been watching all of the setting up my 2020 bullet journal videos that inevitably popped up on my feed closer to New Year's. So I was brainwashed into starting my own, but I had absolutely no idea where to begin. Then I realized that Ryder Carroll, the guy who invented the whole process, had written an entire book talking about how to do it step by step. Plus it was in my local library, so the rest, as they say, was history. This is my very own bullet journal. It has an elephant on it, you know, so clearly the book was helpful. As I mentioned earlier, the bullet journal method takes you step by step on how to start your own bullet journal. The main point being to combine mindfulness with productivity. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really thoughtfully written and illustrated, and it really helped me cement the fundamentals of the practice. The writing itself was also quite beautiful in a lot of places. You could really tell that the author had crafted each sentence with a lot of care and love. I am now obsessed with my bullet journal. I will not stop talking about it to every single person I come across. My friends are tired of me mentioning my bullet journal, but I can't stop because it has changed my life. Anyway, gushing over, if you are at all interested in bullet journaling or are just looking for new ideas to revamp your organizational system, then I cannot recommend this book enough. And last but not least in this reading wrap up is Educated by Tara Westover. Another extremely hyped book. This is a memoir that follows the author from her childhood in rural Idaho, growing up in a Mormon fundamentalist family, preparing for the end of days, to leaving that life behind to go to university and eventually attend Cambridge, where she would go on to get her PhD. It examines the impact that her seeking out an education had on her relationship with her family. This book is about emancipation. It's about the power of rewriting histories, and it's about the impossible battle between what you owe to family and what you owe to yourself. It was absolutely stunning and did not leave you unscathed. Westover's language, firstly, is cutting and exact, but also incredibly lyrical and sweeping. In one section, she describes writing a history essay for university and how strange it was to be examining the words of, you know, great men like James Madison critically and academically when she had been brought up throughout her childhood to either reject something someone says completely or literally worship it. She writes, "I had been taught to read the words of men like Madison as a cast into which I ought to pour the plaster of my own mind, to be reshaped according to the contours of their faultless model." I think that is one of the most beautiful sentences I have ever read. There are also some really funny moments. Like there's this one scene where Tara is out for dinner with her parents at an Indian restaurant near her university, and suddenly, much to her horror and the discomfort of the other patrons, her father begins to loudly testify about how the days of abomination are upon them. And when her mother tries to calm him down, he yells, "But the world is ending!" And her mother goes, "Of course it is, but let's not discuss it over dinner." I don't know, I found that really funny, and not the least because it mirrors quite a few conversations I've been having over dinner about the climate crisis. Another really huge impact this book had on me is that it made me appreciate my own upbringing, where education was revered and I grew up surrounded by books. The yearning that was there throughout the author's childhood to read and to learn and to go to school, oh, that just really hit home for me. Oh, I could go on and on about this book. I actually listened to this book on audio, and the narrator, Julia Whelan, does an absolutely phenomenal job. She brings the people to life. This book definitely exceeded all of my expectations, and it's been the absolute highlight of my year in books so far. I just cannot recommend it enough. So those are the books I read so far this year. Thank you so much for watching if you've made it this far. Please tell me your thoughts down below on any of the books I've just mentioned. Have you read them? What did you think? Do you agree with my reviews? I hope you're all staying safe and listening to the health experts and looking after your communities. And until next time, I am looking forward to seeing you all again very soon.